Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/historyfangirl. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Kindle, Android, or MP3 player. My guest today is Ravi Mehta. He is the podcast host of the Wealth of Nations podcast, which covers economic history, and he has a master's in political science. And thank you so much for joining us, Ravi.
Hey, I'm glad to be here.
Well, we are talking today about Singapore. And if any listeners have ever been to Singapore or know very much about it, they'll know why somebody who specializes in economic history is the perfect person to talk to about Singapore. Because besides being the most expensive city in the world to live in, and I believe to travel into, it's one of Asia's interesting tiger economies, and it's just a very, very tiny city-state nation at the tip of the Malay peninsula. But it has this ridiculous economy, and I'm quite curious to find out exactly how it got that way. So thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah.
So let's start with what the Malay Peninsula looked like culturally and economically before the British got there. What time period is that, and what was life like there?
So Sir Stamford Raffles, he officially founded Singapore in 1819. So let's talk a little bit about what the region looked like before that. This was sort of an in-between period. So the Dutch had colonized much of this region in the 1700s, 1600s, 1700s, and their empire fell apart. And what replaced it were a series of independent city-states. And these city-states would control the trade, shipping, a lot of commodities like tin, rubber, exotic spices. And in the area around Singapore, the major city-state was the Sultanate of Johor. And that is sort of how the British got involved. They were very involved in the trade at the time. And there was an internal struggle for power within Johor, and Sir Stamford Raffles supported one candidate. And sort of as a reward, he was granted what is today Singapore as territory for the British to build a trading post on. The original inhabitants of what is Singapore today are a group of people known as the Orang Laut, and they're basically sea nomads. If you remember, just a few weeks ago, I saw all over the internet, there were a lot of newspaper articles about how there's a group of people in Indonesia who developed special extra lung capacity because they dive so much. And these aren't the same people, but these are people with a sort of similar cultural background. They fish, they dive for pearls, they monitor the trade routes, and those were some of the original inhabitants of what is Singapore today.
Let's set up the geography a little bit. Just explain the layout of the land of where Singapore is, which kind of explains why such a small territory became its own country.
Right. So, why Singapore is so important economically, a lot of that comes down to geography. If you you open up a globe or a map or whatever, and you try to draw a line from China or Japan or anywhere in East Asia to Europe, what you're going to find is that the whole islands of Indonesia obstruct you. And the easiest way to pass through this entire area is through the Straits of Malacca. And that's sort of where the Malay Peninsula ends and where the island of Sumatra begins. And this little corner, it's incredibly important for controlling all the trade between sort of China and East Asia and Europe. And when Sir Stamford Raffles, saw Singapore, he opened a map and he saw this is just an incredibly strategic location, and whoever controls Singapore can control vast amounts of trade. The second important thing about Singapore is that it has a very deep natural port. And so big ships can land in Singapore, which is a little bit unusual. And this deep port made the location around Singapore as an ideal point for dominating the trade in the entire region.
So when the British take over, what does their colony look like?
Singapore, at the very beginning, had a very small population. In 1824, Singapore only had about 11,000 people. Today, it has 5 million people. It just saw exponential growth throughout the 19th century. There were a small elite of white merchants associated with the British East India Company and other major British business houses, but they're only, according to the 1824 census, out of the 11,000 people, that was only 74, even though this was the elite of the island. The bulk of the population consisted of ethnic Malays, and that's sort of the indigenous people to the region, and Chinese immigrants. There were about 4,600 ethnic Malays and around 3,300 Chinese, and these were the two biggest ethnic groups. And most of them, they came as traders, as part of, to work as sailors in the shipping and loading and unloading the docks. And it was a deeply impoverished group of people. Wages were low, exploitation was high. And that's sort of how the island got its start.
So once it's established and it's kind of settled, what is what does it look like? How does it become, economically powerful in the 19th century? What does the rest of the 19th century look like?
Well, the rest of the 19th century is fueled by a spectacular growth of globalization throughout the world. The area around Indonesia and Malaysia is extremely natural resource rich. And from the perspective of Singapore, it is Malaysia that is of extreme importance because that was a British colony as well. Malaysia became a major producer of rubber and tin. And with the development of the automobile in the early 20th century, rubber production became just incredibly important in tires. And so all of this trade, it's siphoned out of Singapore. And one important point I do want to point out is that at this time, Singapore and Malaysia, they weren't separate countries. Although they were administratively separate, the people in Singapore and the Malaysians, the Malay, saw themselves as part of a single broader unit known as the Strait Settlements. What ended up happening is that Singapore became the biggest entrepot in Southeast Asia. So if any British businessmen, they wanted to work in this region, they would set up their home offices here. And that the trade is what fueled Singapore's initial rise as a center of trade, of commerce, of wholesaling, of financial services, the most sophisticated banks. They would usually have their headquarters in Singapore. So this leads to the question is sort of, why was this the case? Why did everyone want to come to Singapore? Part of it is its geographical advantages. But another part was the British emphasis on the rule of law. And one thing that is important to understand about colonialism in general is that it isn't just one thing. British policies in Myanmar were very different from British policies in Singapore. And in Singapore, since Sir Stamford Raffles, one of the key ingredients was that Singapore was declared to be a free port. That is, anyone could ship anything into Singapore or anything out of Singapore, and they would only have to pay nominal fees. There were no tariffs or trade barriers or anything like that, and that made Singapore ideal for commerce. The second major factor was the emphasis on the rule of law. At that time, Britain had the biggest, most sophisticated industrial economy in the world. And a huge advantage of that was a legal system that allowed companies to settle disputes, disagreements, contract negotiations in the context of a highly sophisticated commercial law. And that commercial law was very much in place in Singapore. And so the other thing is that there were technically at least, there was equality before the law. There were no special privileges. So in the Malay states to the north, the Sultan, he was granted special privileges, and trade had to be negotiated through his allies and his supporters. Whereas in Singapore, it was from the very beginning, there were no special privileges for the traditional elites or anything like that. And all of this made Singapore an ideal place to do business from. By around 1937, and that's when the Japanese invaded Singapore, the colony had a GDP per capita of $2,800, which made it one of the wealthiest places outside of Europe and much wealthier than the surrounding colonies such as India, Myanmar, or Malaysia or Indonesia.
So based on what you just said, I realized I don't really know what it was like to be in Singapore during World War II or what happened there. So what was World War II like in Singapore?
World War II in Singapore was incredibly brutal, as was the Japanese occupation of World War II. The British, when the Japanese invaded Southeast Asia, were caught completely unprepared. They had little ability to defend the region. And when the Japanese invaded, they talked a lot about Asian solidarity, about I think the word was the Asian co-prosperity sphere. But the reality was always very different. Japanese aggression began with its moves in China. And Japanese occupation there, it's the Nanking Massacre, the use of chemical weapons and biological weapons. It was just unspeakably awful. And at the time, the majority population of Singapore was ethnic Chinese. And the ethnic Chinese in Singapore had been vital when it came to donating to China Relief Fund efforts, to financing the Chinese nationalist movement. And so when the Japanese arrived in Singapore, the entire Chinese population was suspect. And what the Japanese followed was a process known as suk ching in Chinese. And what that literally translates through is purge through cleansing. And it was meant to be a systematic purge of all the Chinese people in the Singapore that the Japanese felt could pose a threat. And at first, this was supposed to be a limited process that aimed at Chinese communists, those philanthropists that were most active in the Chinese nationalist movement, and a lot of similar things. But what ended up happening is that the Japanese would collect the Chinese residents in fields for screening to see what is your how sympathetic do we feel you are to Chinese ethnic nationalism or opposed to Japanese colonialism. But what ended up happening is that the Japanese kind of lost their mind. And there's a lot of controversy about how many ethnic Chinese were killed. The official numbers from Japan says that only 5,000 deaths occurred, whereas the current Singaporean government puts the number closer to 70,000.
Oh, wow. That's a huge disparity.
A huge disparity. And I'm just throwing a number out here, but I'm guessing maybe like 12 to 15,000. But it was a huge number. And, what ended up happening is that the Kampetai, the Japanese secret police, they engaged in a series of huge massacres by firing squad. So in Punggol Point, about 400 to 300 Chinese were massacred after the Japanese went door to door. And what they did is they thought that the triads, the traditional Chinese gangs, might be a threat. So they collected every young Chinese man in the area with a tattoo. And they just sort of assumed if you had a tattoo, you were part of a triad, and shot all of these people.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, and there were a lot of areas. In the Changi Road area, there was about 250 people were killed in a plantation. It was absolutely a brutal situation. But Singapore's experience in World War II also shaped a lot of its future outlook. A part of it was that it raised ethnic tensions within Singapore itself.
Between which groups?
Singapore has a huge, very diverse population, but to simplify, the majority, about 60 to 70%, they're ethnic Chinese. But you also had a large population of ethnic Malays and ethnic Indians. India at the time was fighting its own independence struggle, and many ethnic Indians saw the Japanese as potential allies to liberate India from the British. The Japanese also supported liberation movements in Indonesia, and the ethnic Malays had a certain level of sympathy for the Indonesians. And what ended up happening is that the Chinese were treated much more harshly, and a lot of the ethnic Chinese felt that the other minorities were willing to collaborate with the Japanese
in order to get freedom from the British, or for their home countries to get, like, was there a Singapore independence movement at the time, or is this more for sympathy with family members back in their home countries?
So the Singapore movement, I think the impetus, a lot of it came from the British reaction. So Australia is also a British colony, and the Japanese, and it was very clear that the government in Great Britain cared a lot about defending Australia, about making sure it was prepared. But they didn't really do anything for Singapore. And it was clear that the reason this was the case was that Australia is populated by white people, Singapore by ethnic Chinese and Asians.
Okay.
And it became very clear that the Great Britain didn't have Singapore's interests at heart, and the promise that Great Britain would protect Singapore, and that was sort of the legitimacy and justification of British colonial rule, was completely hollow. And I think this is where you start to see a lot of agitation for Singaporean independence.
So how does the rest of World War II unfold in Singapore before we skip ahead to the 50s and 60s?
The Japanese controlled Singapore all the way up until the end of World War II. And the British launched Operation Tide Race, but the operation was launched after Great Britain's surrender. So they just sort of marched in and took everything over. And, given how brutal Japanese occupation was, they were met with applause and cheering and greeted as liberators and all of that.
Now, after the war, do the British just come back in and act like nothing has changed? Or when do we start to see a real independence movement for the Malay Peninsula forming?
So the British, they realize, that the end of colonialism was nigh. There was, from the 1950s onwards, it was very clear that colonialism was going to end, and the British, they were much more interested in figuring out how to make sure that Singapore was friendly to the British, that it was an anti-communist ally, rather than just trying to hold on to Singapore until the bitter end.
Oh, that's interesting. So kind of like how do we unravel this in a way that's beneficial and kind of good for international relations? So what do elections look like in Singapore, and how do we go from it as a colony to it as an independent nation?
So the first time general elections were held in Singapore was in 1948. And up until then, the way the institutions of Singapore worked was that the British would appoint representatives, and sort of British appointed representatives would make all of the decisions and officially run the colony as a colony. But at the same time, the British made up a very small percentage of the overall population. And the British colonialism always had an intense lazy streak. So they would aim to do as little as possible. And the Chinese Chamber of Commerce became one of the key intermediary institutions between the official British government and the mass of the Chinese population. And so prominent merchants would be regularly consulted to make sure that, British policy would go over well with the ethnic Chinese, who were essential for the stable running of Singapore as a colony. But after World War II, this highly paternalistic, highly limited mode of government was quickly becoming outdated. And the first general elections were held in 1948, but it was limited to British subjects. And there were rules about who was and wasn't a British subject. I think it was you had to be born within the British Empire, had to be living them for a certain number of years. And it was less than 5% of the population that were even eligible to vote at the time.
Oh, wow.
Right. So I'm not sure how meaningful. It's basically a continuation of the old system where the rich business, the wealthy Chinese businessmen had a say. And now the restrictions were so tight that essentially it's still the wealthy Chinese businessmen have a say. The first real elections were in 1955. And in a lot of ways, the 1955 elections are the only free and fair elections that Singapore has ever had. And they were won by the Labour Front under David Marshall. And David Marshall, he's an interesting character in his own right. He was chief minister from 1955 to 1956. And he was born in Singapore to a family of Sephardi Jews. That's Jews from what is Baghdad.
Okay.
And he was originally Mashal, as what his last name, but he anglicized it to Marshall. But he was volunteered for British military service. He was, he saw action against the Imperial Japanese Army. He was a former prisoner of war. And, the Japanese military, they had a reputation for being absolutely brutal against people they imprisoned, and they saw them with contempt. And he formed the Labour Front, and that was a left-wing political party. And from the very beginning, in the 1950s, the most important force in politics in Singapore were labor unions. They were associations, and that organized the local population. And many of these associations, they're pan-ethnic. They included members from all ethnicities, and these were the backbone, the labor unions, of the independence movement and of political organization in 1955. And as a little bit of a side note, in this election, Lee Kuan Yew, his party, the People's Action Party, they won 8.7% of the vote, and 3 out of the 17 seats, or 3 out of the 25 seats that were up for grabs. And Lee Kuan Yew, he is someone that is going to be just absolutely important when it comes to the history of Singapore going forward.
So how does Singapore is independent, and then they do something which seems to me to be strange, but I'm sure makes complete sense historically. Like, they join with Malaysia to be a country with Malaysia, and then after a bit decide that that's not actually what they want to do. How did that happen?
So the thing to keep in mind is that Singapore and Malaysia, they didn't have separate ethnic identities at that time. Singapore was part of, British Malaya, of the Strait settlements. It was very much seen as an integral and natural part of a single whole unit. But this is where the ethnic politics really comes into play. I'm unfortunately blanking on the exact numbers right now, but what is Malaysia today at that time was around 40% ethnic Chinese and about 55% ethnic Malay, whereas Singapore was about 70% ethnic Chinese and 20% ethnic Malay. And if the two units were put together, the ethnic Chinese would have a small plurality of the total population. And this was something that many of the ethnic Malays, especially the traditional ethnic Malay elite, really feared. And this goes back to something of 19th century history that I didn't really talk about, but I think it's important to understand. When the British took over what is, British Malaya, they worked together with the traditional leaders, and they sort of created an ethnic divide. The traditional aristocracy and the traditional rajas of the Malay people would continue to have a large amount of political power. But they also felt that the society would be most stable if the ethnic Malay were encouraged to stay with their traditional roles as farmers, as fishermen, doing sort of the type of work that the overwhelming majority of people have done for most of history. But as Singapore and Malaya became more developed economically, it was the Chinese, the ethnic Chinese, that came to dominate business, trade, enterprise, manufacturing, the modern sectors of the economy. And so if Malaysia were to be an entire federated entity, you would have a slim political majority in the hands of the ethnic Chinese, but also economic power in their hands. And this is something that a lot of ethnic Malays really feared. And so Lee Kuan Yew, he really pushed for federation. This is something that he believed in because that was something that the ethnic Chinese felt that this is sort of the people of Singapore, not just the Chinese. They felt that they were part of a single unit. But the elites in Malaysia, the UMNO, the United Malays National Organization, and that was the movement, a sort of a conservative movement, but a nationalist movement at the same time. They were very uncomfortable with the direction things were heading in. And as a result, the relationship between the two could never work out. They had the what is today Malaysia wanted to follow one set of economic policies, Singapore another. There were arguments about tax collection, about just thousands of small things, and the bigger issue of inter-ethnic relations. And things really culminated with a series of race riots in 1964. When 22 people were killed, followed by another series in, I want to say 1967, 1969, sorry. 1969, that resulted in another four deaths. And it just became very clear that the union between Singapore and Malaysia was impossible. And if you listen to Lee Kuan Yew, a recording of his speech announcing the end of the federation, it's very clear just how emotional he is. Midway through the speech, he actually breaks down and cries for about 2 to 3 minutes, just so sad that what he really wanted to work, it wasn't making sense.
Now, how do they go from leaving this federation to maybe not the world's, but definitely being one of Asia's most important economies, and being this strange modern economy and surrounded by the rest of Southeast Asia? It's such having backpacked. Well, it wasn't backpacking because they had a big suitcase, but traveling around Southeast Asia, when you get off in Singapore, it feels like you're on a different version of the continent. Like that everybody else is doing something totally different than what Singapore is doing. And I just, it's so crazy to me that they make that jump in 50 years.
Yeah, Singapore. So just one thing to keep in mind is the current government of Singapore. It has a narrative that Singapore went from being a malaria-infested swamp with nothing in 1965 when it came to power. 1963 when it came to power, to the wealthiest nation in the world today. But it was even in 1963, it was the wealthiest region in Southeast Asia and Asia as a whole, because of its historic role as a trade entrepot. But from the 1960s onwards, Singapore also becomes a huge manufacturing hub, especially for labor-intensive manufacturing exports. And if you look at the GDP growth rate numbers for this period, especially in the 1960s, it's astonishing. From 1960 to 1968, GDP growth in Singapore, it averaged up until 1972. GDP growth then averaged around 12 to 13% a year. From 1966 to 1972, GDP growth rate was never less than 10%.
And just to put that in perspective, what is China at right now? And the U.S. bounces between like 2 and 3% right now, correct?
The U.S. is usually at around 2 to 3%. China right now, it's around 6 and 7, although during the heyday of its growth miracle in the 1990s and 2000s, China was around 8, 9, sometimes 10%.
So we're still talking about Singapore is growing at a rate that is faster than China was growing in the last few decades.
Yeah, during the late 60s and 70s, yeah, absolutely. And so, this sort of leads you naturally to the question, why was this the case? What made Singapore so unique? And I think there are a lot of things you have to look at. The first, Singapore from the very beginning had a very pro-business set of policies. And I think this is a little bit ironic because Lee Kuan Yew, who was the prime minister of Singapore from 1959 to 1990, sort of a colossus of Singaporean history, he started out as a very left-wing politician. His People's Action Party, they were seen as left-wing radicals, at times instigating strikes, being very anti-business. But almost as soon as he comes to power, what he does is he subsumes all of the existing very politicized labor unions into a single national union and makes it very clear that the job of these unions is to make sure that wages stay as low as possible. And this plays a major role in attracting businesses because, you can manufacture things, like clothing, electronics, where the chief cost is labor, and labor in Singapore is cheap. A second major element of Singapore's economic miracle is that Singapore, from the very beginning, was very open to trade. During the 1960s and 1970s, you look throughout the developing world, places like India and Latin America, a lot of countries felt that trade was something dangerous, that it was international trade almost by its nature was exploitative. But Singapore, as a small island nation, it saw that wasn't an option. And so it was very open for imports and exports. And during this period, exports grew about 10, 15% a year. Singapore also inherited the legal traditions of the British Empire. The sort of British courts, the rule of law, that, business was done in a way that was fair and transparent. And for this entire period, although Singapore is effectively a dictatorship, I don't know if dictatorship is the word I would use, but it also has a reputation for honest and efficient administration, which was makes it very different from its neighbors such as Malaysia or Singapore, or sorry, as Malaysia or Indonesia.
Well, Malaysia's having problems with corruption to this day. News out of Malaysia this year has been very interesting.
Right, and if anything, Indonesia is far worse.
Oh, really?
In 1996, right before their economy collapsed, General Suharto was his family had accumulated something like $40 billion worth of wealth in his own hands. And that was really never the case in Singapore. And the government was also very, very active in trying to get foreign investments into Singapore. What they would do is they would build infrastructure such as roads, ports, to make Singapore a very attractive place to do business. But they would also offer, they would basically tell foreign companies, you don't have to pay taxes for the next 5 years or the next 10 years, that you can repatriate all of your profits. We're gonna offer as many incentives as we can afford. And sort of the flip side of that was a tendency to underinvest in social services. And so all of this very activist government trying to attract new industries and to invest in ports and infrastructure, the low wages, its open market policies all combined to make Singapore a very attractive place to set up manufacturing facilities. And from the 1960s onwards, that's really been key to Singapore's economic growth miracle.
Now, Singapore today, I don't know what its reputation really is amongst people who aren't into economics and business, but it's just a very different place. It has a lot of rules. For example, my taxi driver kept reminding me that they don't sell gum, that if I brought gum with me, don't chew it and spit it out. Like, it's a very different kind of society. It seems both like a great place and a terrible place to be at the same time, and also a very delicious place to be and a very expensive place to be. For example, the cheapest hotel I could get was like $80 a night, and that's in Southeast Asia, where you're used to paying like $12 a night everywhere else. So it was a shock. And how did it turn the corner and just become this singular place? How did it gain the reputation in the last like decade or so as the place for international business? Is there anything else that happened beyond the reforms from the 70s and 80s?
So one of the things about the Singaporean government is it's a very forward-thinking government. And one part of its sort of reputation for efficiency is the attitude it takes towards governance. And as an American, we kind of tend to think of bureaucrats as sort of lazy and not very valuable. Whereas in Singapore, civil servants, they're paid good money, $100,000, $120,000. I believe the head of the Singaporean central bank is the highest paid civil servant in the world.
Oh, wow. That makes sense, though, because the way that you stave off corruption is to pay people a wage that makes it so that losing that job isn't worth it, and they don't feel economic needs, so they don't need to take bribes.
And I think that even more than that is that, if I graduate from Harvard or Wharton or somewhere like that, why should I go work with the government if I'm sort of the best and brightest my country has to offer? Why not go work for a hedge fund or, a tech startup where I can make millions? And the fact that Singapore has a lot of very forward-looking bureaucrats means that for a lot of policies, they're willing to experiment. So, for example, congestion charging. Singapore was one of the first countries to force commuters to pay for using the roads at the busiest periods. And this has been a policy that has been very successful in reducing traffic, as unpopular as it is. And it's in a lot of areas, the Singapore government is very active in training its workers to be in the latest technologies and having some of the best. You look at international test scores in math and science. There's the OECD's PISA and the TIMSS. And Singapore is always at the very top. And, from the perspective of foreign corporation, having some of the best engineers, computer programmers, et cetera, right at your doorstep, that's another huge advantage. And the fact that you can have your money in Singapore, it ends up being as a haven. So if I'm in Malaysia or I'm in Indonesia, I would rather have my investments in Singapore where I don't have to worry about some grabbing government official or anything like that. And sort of this willingness to be flexible, innovative, has really made Singapore's government somewhat unique in the world.
So you mentioned, we were kind of talking about the beginning of the economics of modern Singapore, that it was a balance of, really good oversight and rule of law, but not great investment in the human services side. Has that changed?
I think it would be more accurate to say that in Singapore, the government expects you to be reliant on yourself. Singapore has something called the Central Provident Fund. And on surface, it looks like our Social Security, where you sort of make payments in, and then when you retire, you can take payments out. But it's really more a forced savings system. So about 50% of your wages in the 1950s and 60s, or in the 1960s and 70s, they had to go into the Central Provident Fund. And you were forced to save money. The number has gone down since then, but that's sort of the core of Singapore's social system, is that it's not that the government provides for you, but the government forces you to save money so you can provide for yourself.
And how does that play out in its healthcare and housing situation?
Sure. So one of the very interesting things about Singapore, and sort of why Singapore in terms of its expenses will feel very different from the perspective of a local as opposed to a tourist or an expatriate, is that housing in Singapore is almost entirely controlled by the government. So they've got something called the Housing Development Boards, and about 80% of the people of Singapore live in government-owned housing, which makes it very different from somewhere like the U.S. And the government offers subsidized rates so that housing can be affordable for most Singaporeans. And it's also very paternalistic. And one thing to understand about Singapore is that it's not a democracy, even though they have elections and a press and everything like that. It's a very circumscribed form of democracy. So the government has a habit of launching defamation or libel lawsuits against anyone who speaks ill against them. Opposition candidates can find just random court cases against them. In the 1959 election, what the government did is that there was a certain period where you're supposed to register as a candidate, and they just didn't. They arrested the opposition leaders just for that 1 day period where you could register as a candidate.
That's interesting, because normally when you think about countries that have really smooth operating bureaucracies and really are invested in the rule of law, that also includes the free and fair elections aspect of that. Not that any nation is perfect, but it's interesting that they have a balance of both political election corruption and but also good law enforcement.
Yeah, and one of the biggest parts of this is how the housing development boards are run. The official justification for some of these policies is that they need to keep balance. But what they do is they make sure that every single apartment complex has to have a balance of a certain number of each ethnic group. They try really hard to make sure that they sort of calculate what kind of people would normally oppose the government. And they make sure that all those people never live in the same area so they can unite politically. And they use the housing system also as a tool of sort of social policy. So it is very hard if you're a single person to get your own place. You have to be married. If you're a single parent, the government will discriminate against you in housing because they want to discourage that sort of thing. The chewing gum, that's sort of the very famous thing about Singapore. but they have a lot of laws very much oriented towards maintaining a sort of traditional morality. And the allocation of housing is sort of one of the biggest sticks that the government uses it. And because housing in the subsidized system is so much cheaper, it sort of forces a certain level of social conformity.
That's so interesting. It's almost like a anti-gerrymandering or a different form of gerrymandering in terms of like instead of drawing the districts to fit the population, you move the population to get the districts you want. That's so
and then what you also
crazy.
do is so let's say let's say you one district council votes for the opposition. The government, they make sure that, oh, what? Your power went out 6 times this week. Oh, you've got problems with the taps? Huh. I wonder how that happened.
So how does this not end up spilling out, though, into incompetency in government? If it just, I guess to me, and you're probably the perfect person to talk about this with, it just seems like the economic incentives would not be to run a smooth government. The economic incentives would be to get things from the population if you have the population at your disposal in this way. How do they maintain that balance?
And that's really one of sort of the mysteries of Singapore.
Okay.
It's one of the few places that it has honest government that also has completely rigged the system in its favor. And I think part of it is just the whole idea of a Weberian bureaucracy. That's, the bureaucrats, they've got a job, and they very much believe that their job is maximizing GDP growth. And there is corruption, there are scandals. The government has always been very cozy to big business. But I think at the end of the day, I think it is big business in so much as that they need a government that provides them. Like if I want to, let's say I've got my international headquarters. I'm a major multinational. I'm a tech company. I'm Broadcom. I'm Avago. The government knows that if these foreign corporations cease to see Singapore as an attractive place to do business, they can leave at any time, and that terrifies the government, and that forces them to stay on the straight and narrow and limits the level of bribery and corruption that's possible.
Okay, well, that makes sense. It's also kind of scary / interesting to think about since in the United States we have a government that is so, on every level, that are so friendly to businesses.
So that's this is what my dissertation was going to be about. So I'm going to bore you a little bit. Not bore you, but hopefully not bore you. But the idea of my dissertation was that the corruption becomes bad when it's inwardly oriented. So let's say I've got a t-shirt factory and my cousin's the president. I have, and if I'm selling almost entirely to a domestic market, I might tell my president, hey, let's make a rule saying you need a license to make t-shirts and give me the only license. Like, this sounds like a great idea. But let's say I'm in a tiny country like Singapore. Like, Singapore's market is small. I want my t-shirts to sell in China and South Africa and the US and the UK and everywhere. And the only way I can do this is to make good t-shirts. And so I'll tell my cousin, the president, that, look, I need roads, I need electricity, I need all sorts, I need cheap access to imports, I need a good port. So that the demands that I'm going to make are very different than if I'm an inward-oriented business.
Okay, that makes sense.
So that's sort of, my dissertation wasn't going to be about Singapore, but this sort of idea is something you see time and time again throughout the developing world.
So it's funny just because since Singapore is kind of an economy without a nation almost, it's a fun place to look at for examples of systems and the way things can work because it's, on the one hand, it's such a singular place, but on the other, it's kind of like not pure capitalism, but if capitalism was really in charge.
Well, the government, they intervene all the time. So like you've got a lot of libertarian think tanks still have rankings for how free market a place is. And Singapore and Hong Kong will often rank one or two. It's just that they do government intervention very differently than we do. The government controls all the housing. One thing I'll often hear conservatives in America talk about is the Singapore healthcare model. And at first sight, it's very free market. About 70% of total expenditures come from out of pocket. But the only reason this can happen is that the government, it forces people to have massive saving accounts, have hundreds of thousands of dollars in savings. It forces hospitals to keep their prices low. It intervenes all the time. It just does it in a way that's very different than what we're used to.
Now, as someone who thinks about economics all the time, what do you think is like the biggest plus of the Singapore system, and what do you think is the biggest drawback?
I think the biggest plus, the first is just how open to markets Singapore has been, how open its economy is, how it attracts foreign investment, it exports manufactured goods, and how the government has really oriented its policy around this. And the second thing is just how serious the Singaporean government takes issues of governance, and their belief that its bureaucrats aren't bad, but if we treat them properly, if we make civil service and governments something that's high prestige, we can really come up with innovative policies. If I have to say a downside, it's not exactly a downside, but the fact that Singapore is unusual. It's a small island at a strategic location with a population of 5 million people. About 30% of population are migrant workers, sort of the same kind of migrant workers you hear about in Dubai or the UAE and working in exploitative conditions. You can reach one end to another in a few hours. There's so much about Singapore that's unusual. And while there are lessons to be learned from Singapore, there's just no way to wholesale import the Singaporean model. Like Singapore's forced savings system works because people can't vote, because everyone hates it. People want free healthcare. But their system is also highly efficient. Singapore, the government expends less per capita in healthcare than any other country, while still getting, the sort of results we expect in places like Denmark and France. But they do it in a way that people hate. And so it's sort of, no country can be Singapore. There can only be one country like this, and you always have to be careful in trying to copy what Singapore has done, even though the accomplishments are just so impressive. The biggest drawback to living in Singapore is just the fact that you don't have freedom. The way the government tries to control everything, no free press, no real elections. And the famous one is chewing gum, but also attitudes towards drug. That's being a drug dealer is punishable by death in Singapore. Everything from spitting to public urination will get just massive fines, and this level of social control. And the other one is that 30% of the population are migrant workers. And they usually make around $8 to $10 an hour. They don't have access to public services. They're often treated in a very exploitative manner. And Singapore might be great if you're either a citizen or a wealthy expat. But for those 30% of people, who are short-term migrants, they make much more money than they would in their home country. And I don't want to, I think that's important, but it's not perfect for everyone.
So before I ask you that, so why don't you tell us a little bit about your podcast? Because if people like economic history, they should definitely check it out.
Sure. My podcast is the Wealth of Nations podcast. It's a podcast about the politics, economics, and history of global development. I talk about a lot of subjects. So my most recent episode was about how NAFTA has transformed Mexico, and why the car industry has grown so fast, but the rest of the economy hasn't. I've done episodes on Robert Mugabe's land reforms in Zimbabwe, about the role Samsung plays in the political economy of South Korea, why all of our clothing is made in Bangladesh, about the legacy of corruption under Suharto. So it's just a wide range of topics covering a lot of things about politics, economics, and history in the developing world.
So where can people find you and your show?
Sure. You can find me at www.wealthofnationspodcast.com. I've got a Facebook page at facebook.com/Wealth of Nations Podcast.
Awesome. So the NAFTA episode sounds super interesting and super timely. And so listeners, if you are interested in how all of those different forces collide, I would definitely suggest checking it out. And then Ravi, thank you so much for coming on the show. And I know you'll be back on it at some point in the future, so we'll have to pick another topic.
Absolutely. I look forward to this. Thank you.
Thank you so much.